So welcome to Retech. Today is just a quick look at a machine that you don't see very often in the UK or even in the USA. It was only really sold in countries like Portugal and a few other places around Europe, and it is the Timex Computer 2048. And today we're going to have a quick overview of the machine. It's going to be two parts. It's going to be a quick overview of the machine as it is, and to see what it's all about. And in the next episode we're going to cover the compatibility issues of the machine, whether it is a good alternative to a ZX Spectrum or an interesting alternative to a ZX Spectrum. And we're going to take a more in-depth look at it. But for now we're going to have a look at the Timex Computer 2048. Okay, so for those of you who have been watching this channel, you may or may not recognise this. It looks like a Spectrum Plus, but it's actually a Harlequin Spectrum Plus, or a recreated ZX Spectrum Plus with modern components. And it works very, very well. So if you haven't seen the video on the Harlequin, I'd suggest you having a quick look at that, because it's a really nice recreation of a Spectrum Plus using modern components. And if you have a look behind, you'll see an original ZX Spectrum Plus 48K with a dedicated edition of a NSD drive on the side, which was donated by youmakerobots.com. and it really is a nice addition to a ZX Spectrum Plus or a 128, because it fits it really well. But it's not what we're talking about today. What we're talking about today is arguably another version of what the Harlequin was. And what I mean by that, it's a clone of the original ZX Spectrum. And those of you who are not familiar with this model, it is an official model. It's a clone of the ZX Spectrum, and it's very close, kind of in principle, to a ZX Spectrum Plus. So if you look at the original ZX Spectrum on top, you'll see that the actual clone underneath is a lot bigger. And it's quite a sizable chunk of plastic. It's not only wider and deeper, it's also longer. And it's a Timex Computer 2048. Not to be mixed up with the Timex Sinclair 2048, which is a prototype which then went on to be the 2068 and primarily sold as an NTS version in the United States. This is a PAL 2048, and although it looks radically different to a standard Sinclair Spectrum or even a Spectrum Plus, it's a kind of a hybrid between the two. It has plastic keycaps, which are a lot better to type on than the rubber ones, and they are quite well spaced. You can actually use them with a full-size spacebar. And it has a similar beeper speaker. It has 48K memory. It's almost 100% compatible with the ZX Spectrum, but this machine can run CPM, and it can also use 80 column mode, which sets it apart from the ZX Spectrum as a whole. Now, almost compatible because it has a few additions in the ROM which doesn't quite match up to the original Spectrum ROM, but it can run a huge chunk of the ZX Spectrum software library, unlike the 2068, which is virtually incompatible. It really wasn't a ZX Spectrum as kind of the Europeans know it at all. Now, it looks a little bit like some of the Russian clones, and I'm kind of guessing that either the Russians took inspiration from this when they started cloning the Spectrum, or maybe the other way around. So can't be too sure on which way around it was, but this was an official Timex computer. And note, it's not Timex Sinclair like the original prototype 2048 was going to be. So what sets this apart other than its ability to run CPM? Well, for a start, if we look at the machine, you have the standard 9-volt power monitor. It's a composite out. Then you've got your ear and microphone and also your TV. But also it has a joystick port built into it. And one other thing it has is a proper power switch that the original ZX Spectrum never had. Now this is part one of a two-part video because this is just the overview of the machine and then to see what it looks like. And if we look inside of the machine, you will see that it looks very different to a standard ZX Spectrum, because if you actually look at the circuit board itself, it's no longer your standard dip package, it's now a square package. Also, it has a built-in joystick port on the left, which you can see clearly on this board. It has a completely different ribbon connector for the keyboard, which this one's more robust and it's very much less of a cost-reduced item. And you can see how the circuitry's kind of changed. It's got fewer memory chips, and it looks kind of as if the case wasn't designed for the board, because if you look at the speaker, you got a little beeper speaker on the bottom of the board, but a huge great grill for where what looked like a proper speaker should have been. And then at the front you have this massive piece of angle iron which is literally bolted onto the heatsink, onto the regulator. So it's kind of a bit of a hybrid, because in some ways it's a lot more advanced than the original ZX Spectrum was, using a lot nicer components really, and a lot more modern components, but it's also got a little bit of Heath Robinson thrown in, such as that big piece of angle iron, etc., and the case that doesn't really fit the model. So if you compare that to the original ZX Spectrum circuit board, you will actually see that the ZX Spectrum circuit board on the original takes up a lot more room inside this case. So you've got a standard dual inline pin ULA, CPU, there's a lot more chips for the memory, you've got two independent keyboard connectors and no joystick port, and everything's in a slightly different position and location on the board. In fact, this one actually uses a lot more ICs and components than the machine that's underneath it. So apart from the way it looks, which is kind of nice, I quite like it, it's a nice looking machine really, the way it feels on the keyboard is much better than what you'd find on an Auric One, because the keys actually fit your fingers rather than kind of little round knobbles which are the Auric One standard. But it's not quite as good as a standard keyboard. But in saying that, it still feels a lot nicer than the Sinclair Spectrum Plus, and it's kind of weird plasticky membrane keyboard thing that they put on there, and it was an improvement over the rubber keyed Spectrum, but this is actually usable and the keys don't stick together in the way the Spectrum Plus does sometimes. So overall it's a nice little machine. Most of the operation of this machine is very similar to the ZX Spectrum 48, but this has two modes. It has mode 0, 256x192 for its graphical mode, or it has 512x192, which is a lot higher than a standard ZX Spectrum. To use those modes you have to use a randomized user command, and to do this you just type in randomized user 31488, and what that will do, that will reset the machine, and now you can use the extended basic that was actually on the machine. So if you wanted to use 64 columns or 80 columns on your printer, this is how you would do it. So it would also allow you to use extended basic for circle, line, so you got 3 points on the line which you didn't normally have, and also you plot X and Y. One of the other things that this machine was good at was actually able to print in 80 or 85 columns, which couldn't be really done very well on a ZX Spectrum. And it also has a new character set in 85 columns with 6 by 8 pixels, and using the print #5 and list #5 commands. So it has a few different functions that the original ZX Spectrum could never have. Now we're going to cover some of these in a lot more depth and detail in the next video when we start finding out how compatible this machine really is. But in the UK it's very hard to find. But other than the special features that are in the basic, most people in the UK won't use them. They'll just use, you know, your usual ZX Spectrum, because that's what it'll be. So, you know, everything works exactly as it should do. And for all intents and purposes it's just a ZX Spectrum, but with a slightly nicer keyboard, a full-size space bar, composite out, which is a bonus. It's PAL, it's got a built-in joystick port, and the edge connector on it is meant to be, if I lift it up, just about compatible with standard ZX Spectrum peripherals. And you know, it's well made. It's arguably better made than this, and it uses nicer components, so technically it should be a better machine for everyday use. So this is your Timex Computer 2048. It's not really related to the American Silver Timex Sinclair machine, because it is almost a compatible ZX Spectrum, where the American version isn't. You can make it compatible to a point with an add-on cartridge in the USA version, but this one is almost there right out of the box. And in the UK it's an unusual machine. It's sold in Portugal, built in Poland, and it was done that way because it was so much easier to get this machine than it was this machine at the time, due to, you know, usual import restrictions and so on. Plus, you know, it was a homegrown machine. So that's your Timex Computer 2048. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed this quick overview of the 2048. There's more to come, and we're going to go into more in-depth features of the machine and also compatibility with hardware in the next episode. It's a worthy machine to do a more in-depth review on it, and that's what we're going to do. So stick around. I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you'll subscribe, and there's more to come. So thank you very much for watching. Thank you.